The title of the lecture may seem a little daunting. It's not exactly what is up there. I am a teacher, and my job, my primary function at Yad Vashem is to teach teachers. And I am going to move forward with the presumption that all of you are here tonight because you're active learners. And when the teachers come to Yad Vashem, the first lecture that they hear is this one on the International School's educational philosophy. It is, in effect, an overview of the Holocaust. We can't know how we're going to teach without knowing what we're teaching. And so my goal tonight, with your permission, is to spend this time giving you a more in-depth look at what we're talking about and who we're talking about when we talk about the Holocaust. So forgive me if from time to time I refer to you as educators. It's kind of a natural way that I speak, but I see you certainly as learners. And part of the reason that I'm here tonight is to also learn from you. So let's begin. This may or may not be a familiar face to you. This is Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin was a Jew during this period in Europe. He lost 49 family members in the Holocaust. After the war, he was determined to make sure that this kind of thing would not happen again. And he is considered to be the father of the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. Now, what's included in that convention? When we talk about genocidal activities in the world then and now, we are looking at bullet points of how we define a genocide. And these points include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting conditions of life on the group calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children. All of these conditions were present in the Holocaust. So what makes the Holocaust unprecedented in terms of genocide? Unprecedented, not unique, because unique suggests that something happened once and can never happen again. And we know too sadly that we live in a world where genocide has happened again and again. So when we begin to define the Holocaust, we go to some of our colleagues across the world. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum says in its definition, in part, the Holocaust was the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews. During the era of the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial inferiority, including Roma, disabled, and some Slavic peoples. The Imperial War Museum in London says, the Holocaust is the term used to describe the systematic and wholesale slaughter of the Jews of Europe by the Nazis and their collaborators during the Second World War. Other groups besides the Jews fell victim to Nazi racial policy, and again an elaboration, Poles, Slavs, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma, and Sinti. And finally, Yad Vashem's definition. The Holocaust was unprecedented genocide, total and systematic, perpetrated by Nazi Germany and its collaborators with the aim of annihilating the Jewish people. All three definitions have many common elements, including the acknowledgement of mass genocidal acts to other people. So why am I making this distinction with you? Why is it so important that we look at these definitions. The Holocaust is the genocide of the Jews. There are no other victims of the Holocaust. There are other victims of Nazi racial ideology. There are other victims of perpetration. There are other genocidal events going on during the period from 39 to 45. But when we speak about the Holocaust, we're speaking about an unprecedented genocidal event. Now, I want to be very clear about one thing. If the only thing you hear me say tonight that you take away is this, please take this away. I'm not so determined about this definition because there is any kind of a hierarchy of suffering. This is not about anyone's tragedy or pain being greater or less than anybody else's. Any genocidal event, any loss of human life diminishes all of us everywhere, even today. The reason I want you to be so specific about the definition of the Holocaust is to give proper place to other genocidal events. When I work with teachers at Yad Vashem, teachers that have come from all over the world, there will be teachers that tell me, oh yes, and I teach about the other victims of the Holocaust. What does that mean in reality for a teacher? It means that the Sinti Roma or the Poles or the disabled get a passing mention. These are important stories, equally important stories. They deserve their own place, their own research, their own acknowledgement. So I will say to teachers when they come to Yad Vashem, if you think that the story of the Sinti Roma is an important one to tell, do the research, write your lessons, and tell that story. Don't make anyone a victim of someone else's tragic event. But what else makes the Holocaust different from other genocides? The Holocaust stands as the paradigmatic genocidal event of the 20th century. How do we know this? There are 4 key elements that separate the Holocaust from other genocides. The first is totality. The Holocaust targeted every single Jew as defined by the Nazis. If you didn't see yourself as a Jew, but the Third Reich did see you as a Jew, that was all that mattered. The second point is universality. We look at the Holocaust as a European event, and that's exactly what it was. But that was not the long-term plan of the Third Reich. The plan was a genocidal event of the Jewish people that targeted every Jew living everywhere on planet Earth. It was intended to be complete and total annihilation of the Jewish people, their culture, their resources, everything. The third element that defines the Holocaust as unprecedented is ideology. When we look at genocidal events in general, we have a pragmatic reason. We want the land, we want the oil, we want something. And after we know what we want, we wrap an ideology around it. Not so in the Holocaust. The Holocaust is upside down in terms of this. First comes the ideology, and then comes the pragmatic event, the pragmatic justification for what we're doing. And finally, the last marker, the last point that I want to bring to your attention is racism. In Nazi ideology, there was a hierarchy of races. This was, of course, not the only genocidal event that the Nazis had intended as they marched forward. There was a genocidal event of the Sinti Roma. 90 to 100,000 Sinti Roma were murdered during this period. The Poles is considered a different genocidal event. And the best historiography we have today suggests that had the Third Reich been successful in winning the war and moving forward, there would have also been a genocidal event planned against the Czechs and the people of the Baltic regions. So now that we know that this is a Jewish story, we need to talk, now that we have the what, about the who of the Holocaust. How we tell the story is as important as the story that we tell. When we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about three specific groups of people. Well, maybe not so specific, but three categories. And traditionally, they are the victims, the perpetrators, and the bystanders. I've changed it, as you can see here, to the Jews, the perpetrators, and the bystanders, because the Jews were not born as victims. If we're going to look seriously at the Holocaust, we need to know who the Jewish people were before there was a Holocaust. And so we begin any kind of serious endeavor in terms of learning by looking at a long history of a people who had tremendous culture, learning, education, religious life. In order to know what we lost, we have to know what we had. This is a film that will give us a glimpse into what life was like for Jews in Europe before there was a Holocaust. Now, there's a lot in that film that I'm sure does not resonate for you, but there are pieces of it that are universal experiences. Mothers still peel potatoes and bathe babies, and little girls still go to the beach with their grandfathers. That last woman that you see who's waving goodbye, I don't know who she's waving goodbye to, but I'm fairly certain that she doesn't realize that she's waving goodbye to the life that she has known. The children's choir that you saw at the beginning of the film and again at the end is a choir in a place called Munkacs, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, depending on where we are in terms of the interwar period or during the years of the war. The best historiography we have says that none of those children survived. How would the world have been different if 10, 15, 2 of those children had been allowed to live? These were all people, extraordinary people, ordinary people, people that had lives, people that deserved to have lives, and hopes, and dreams, and plans for the future. And the Holocaust snuffed that out. So when we begin to look at this period and begin to think seriously about this historic event called the Holocaust, we begin before there is a Holocaust, before the tide turns. But ultimately we can't stay there. We have to go into the darkness. There we go. This represents the first period of really seriously tremendous, tumultuous change for the Jewish people. This is the period of ghettoization, when Jews are ripped from their homes and placed in segregated areas, different situations in different places. I'll allow you to do the research on this. But the choiceless choices is a phrase coined by Professor Lawrence Langer, emeritus from Simmons College in Boston. He's the preeminent scholar on Holocaust survivor testimony. And he coined this phrase of choiceless choices because in the war, in the Holocaust, especially in the period of ghettoization and the final solution, if you were a Jew, whatever you did, the agenda was death. If something kept you alive at noon on Monday, it didn't mean that the same kind of a choice would keep you alive on Wednesday. So when we look at the choiceless choices of the Jewish people, we have to examine the kinds of decisions, the areas of decisions that Jews became responsible for. Once the Jewish people were put in the ghettos, there was no longer a support system. The Jewish people in any ghetto became responsible for religious life, for cultural life, for food, for housing, for sanitation, for burial. Everything became the work of the Jewish people to try and keep themselves moving and alive. And so there were various and sundry ways that we begin to examine what happened to these people and the kinds of choices that they could make. One of the issues that we look at is religious life. How do you move forward in the period of ghettoization with this place of complete and extreme deprivation? What do you do about religious life? Do you fast on Yom Kippur? Do you keep kosher? Do you only eat matzah? What do you do if new life comes into the world? Now, in the period of ghettoization, to bring a baby into the world was strictly forbidden. To be pregnant was strictly forbidden. And yet, people continued to bring life into the world. And so one of the stories that we have, and it's my intention over this hour that we have to tell you lots of stories, to introduce you to the face of the individual in the Holocaust. The story is told of Rabbi Yitzhak and Miriam Bloch. Rabbi Bloch is the next in generation after generation after generation in a family of very important rabbis, religious leaders. And Rabbi Block is married to his beautiful wife Miriam for 5 years, and over the period of this 5 years, there's no announcement, no good news, no baby on the way. And in these families, in this time and place, this is of paramount importance. They're looking for a new male generation to continue this educational and rabbinic line of rabbis. 5 years the Blocks are married. There are no babies on the way. They're incarcerated in the Kovno ghetto. And, of course, she becomes pregnant. Now we have decisions to make. Do we keep the baby? Do we try and hide the pregnancy? This was the decision that this couple made. And they're successful. 9 months later, Miriam Block gives birth to a baby boy. In Judaism, now something very important has to happen. On the 8th day, this baby must be circumcised. How do you do this in the Kovno ghetto? Everything is forbidden to the Jews. It's forbidden that she was pregnant. It's forbidden that the baby was born. Certainly a circumcision, a brit milah, is forbidden. But this couple perseveres. 10 men, a minyan, a quorum for prayer, is arranged in the barracks. The 10 men are there. Miriam Bloch is there. The baby also comes. And they're about to circumcise the baby when they hear a car coming down the street. Jews don't have cars in the ghetto. So this is not good news. The ritual circumciser, the Moel, his hand begins to shake. No one knows what to do. The car pulls up directly in front of the barracks, and 2 soldiers get out. One of them stops to light a cigarette. The 10 men look to Mrs. Block. Do you run? Do you hide? Do we run? Do we hide? What do we do? 10 men. They all look to Miriam Bloch to make a decision, and without batting an eye, she says to them, if they're going to shoot us all, let my son die as a Jew. For reasons that no one can explain, once she said that, the soldier outside, who was completely unaware of anything going on inside, dropped his cigarette, stamped it out, they got in the car and drove away. One of the choices of one couple, a courageous, faithful choice made in the ghetto. What other kinds of religious decisions need to be made? Not just in the ghettos, but in the camps. How do we keep holidays? Do we keep holidays? In Auschwitz-Birkenau, in 1944, a 16-year-old girl named Ruth Brand decided to fast on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. It's the day that we fall on our face before the Lord and pray and ask for forgiveness, ask for a new year. A day of complete fast and abstinence, 25 hours, not even a sip of water. It's a long 25 hours, I can tell you from experience, and not an easy one. What does it mean to make a choice to do that in Auschwitz-Birkenau? And on top of that, what does it mean to be 16 years old, a child, and make that kind of a decision? This is Ruth Brand.
I can tell you the Yom Kippur day in Auschwitz and Birkenau. And then you realize how we had to help each other. That day, my cousin Chaya and I were working near the crematorium. And we had to dig and the ashes of our fellowship. My cousin and I decided that we're going to fast. It was a simple decision. We're not going to drink that coffee, so-called coffee in the morning. And the lunch that we get, that soup, we're going to carry it back into the camp. By this time, each one of us had already a cup for the food, which we carried on a string tied around our waist, and we also had a spoon. We were already civilized people. And so that was our decision. The SS found out that we were fasting. So they decided to give us a present. Get up, run, lay down, push up, what they did, and the dogs after us. And if somebody falls, the dogs bite them. And this went on I don't know how long. And then we are told, go sit down and eat. So we go sit down. Most of the girls start eating. I'm sitting there with my cousin and said, not eating. And she said, okay, I want you to eat it. Then the other girls say, what's happening to you? Why aren't you eating? My cousin said, she's much younger than I am. She doesn't want to eat, so I can't eat either. So he asked me, what's with you? I said, well, today is Yom Kippur and I'm fasting. And he said, don't you see that God doesn't want us to fast? If he wanted us to fast, he would have given us much better conditions. And I say, well, maybe he wants to see that dafka, that in spite of it, we are still going to fast. So we're fasting. And in the evening when we took that soup back to the camp, it was sour, it was spoiled, because it was a very, very hot day in Auschwitz that day. On Yom Kippur, 1944.
Obviously, I do the work that I do because I think it's not only important to remember the historical event, but I think that it's relevant to all of us in the 21st century. Let me point out several things for your consideration in terms of Ruth's testimony. She says early on, we had a cup and a spoon which we tied around our waist with a string. We were already civilized people. How do we define ourselves as civilized people? Is it what we have? Is it what we do? Is it what we believe? Is it who we are? Ruth goes on to say that her cousin Haya tells the other girls, well, she's much younger than I am. If she's not going to eat, I can't eat. In 21st century parlance, we would refer to that as peer pressure. Now, peer pressure, generally speaking, has a very bad reputation. Peer pressure usually encourages people not to be their best selves. But in this particular case, I suggest to you that peer pressure worked for the good of both girls. And finally, there is the conversation with the girls, why aren't you eating? Don't you see, if God wanted us to fast, he would have given us better conditions? And Ruth, without missing a beat, says, well, maybe God wants to see if in spite of the conditions, we'll still fast. I suggest to you that Ruth Brand knew long before she came to Auschwitz who she was and what she believed in, what her moral and ethical rudder was, And that's why her expression is instantaneous. Ruth didn't have to think about it any more than Miriam Bloch didn't know exactly what to say in that moment. They both knew what they thought, what they believed in, and what the proper course of action was without hesitation, because they weren't identifying it and refining it in that moment. It was part of who they are, who they were. And I suggest to you that if we talk in an educational venue, that one of the great gifts that Holocaust survivors give us, and even those who were murdered in the Holocaust, they give us the opportunity to look at their actions and the historical event and make a connection to our own lives, and give us the opportunity to say, especially among our students and young people, who am I in my own life, in my own community? Who do I want to be as time goes forward?
I can tell you.
Eric Taylor was a liberator at Bergen-Belsen, and this is part of the art as historical testimony that many, many different artists have given us, he being one of them. I added this at the bottom because when Ruth Brand used to come to Yad Vashem and give her testimony, there was always a place where she would stop, and it was a very difficult testimony. It began on the ramp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. But partway through, she would stop and she would look at the assembled people before her, and she would say in that quiet little voice that you just heard, you know, sometimes I hear someone say that they have nothing. And there would be this long, well, it seemed long, uncomfortable pause. And then she would say, and if I think it's someone who can learn, I tell them what nothing really is. I must have heard Ruth Brand give her testimony 30 times at Yad Vashem. And I always knew that she was going to say that. And there wasn't a time that she said it that I didn't ask myself, am I grateful enough for the life I have and the people that I share it with? Ultimately, thank God, the Holocaust comes to an end, the war comes to an end, and we move, in terms of the Jewish story, into what we call the return to life. What happens to the Jewish people after the camps are liberated? At the end of the war, there are 11,000 Jewish individuals in the now displaced persons camp of Bergen-Belsen. 11,000. In 1946, there are 1,070 weddings. What does it mean to come out of the Holocaust, where humanity in general has failed you, and commit your life to another human being? What kind of courage does that take? By 1951, over 2,000 babies had been born in Bergen-Belsen. What kind of courage does it take to bring new life into a world that was determined about its destruction? I tell students and teachers, you want heroes? You want someone to emulate, someone to look up to? There they are. Those are the real heroes of the 20th century. Those are people who came out of the most unimaginable tragic conditions and recommitted to a spouse, recommitted to bringing new life into the world, became productive members of their societies wherever they chose to go, whether it was Australia or Israel or Canada. Some of them became great philanthropists. They could have made a different choice. They chose to move forward in positive, productive, and contributing ways. The great German Jewish philosopher Emil Fackenheim, wrote a wonderful piece entitled The 614th Commandment. You may or may not be aware of the fact that the Jewish people live by 613 commandments. So what's the 614th commandment? Fackenheim writes articulately and passionately that the 614th commandment of the Jewish people is grant Hitler no posthumous victories. They married, they had children, they became productive members of society. That is the 614th commandment. There are many, many stories about all of this that are running through my head right now. Ones that I want to tell you, ones that I'm trying to sift through because of the time constraints that we have. But let me share one story that's along the same lines. And it's perhaps the easiest one to share in this moment. About 20 years ago, the first invitation to Yad Vashem from the staff at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the museum there, came for Yad Vashem scholars and educators to come to Auschwitz-Birkenau and learn how to guide in the camp. There were meetings at Yad Vashem, and I don't know how much contact you have with Israelis, but they are very outspoken and passionate and effusive. And in the course of all of these meetings that were mostly about the technical kinds of things, where they were going to go, when they were going to go, how they were going to do it, two of the members of this particular mission, not related to each other, said to their colleagues and friends, you know, our parents were in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and when we get to the office, we want to go in and see what kind of information there is. There's a tremendous Israeli kind of an uproar in the room. No, you don't need to do it. It's a waste of time. You know what's there. It's a little card. It just says their name, their number. Forget about it. These two people were determined. They weren't going to Auschwitz-Birkenau and not see if there was something they could learn about their parents. The group says, you know, we'll talk about it when we get there. Let's just move forward. The day comes, they're in Birkenau, they get to the office, and all of their friends and colleagues, the other people from Yad Vashem, said, you know what, we don't want you to miss anything. So we're going to sit right here outside. You go into the office, we'll wait for you. And they say to each other, 5 minutes. It can't take any longer than 5 minutes. We all know there is nothing in there. And so these Israelis from Yad Vashem are sitting in the sunshine, and 5 minutes goes by, and 15 minutes goes by. 20 minutes, they're saying to themselves, where did they go? What happened to them? At 25 minutes, these two individuals, a man and a woman, stumble through the doors of the offices at Birkenau, sobbing. Their colleagues say, we've never seen people crying this hard. When they can collect themselves, they tell their colleagues from Yad Vashem that in the offices of Birkenau, they found out that they had brothers and sisters that they never knew that were murdered in the Holocaust. How much pain do you have to be in to know that your son or daughter has devoted their entire professional life to your history and not tell them that you had another family? How much pain do you have to be in? And yet these are the people that went to America, that went to Canada, that came to Australia and New Zealand and made full and productive lives. That's why, in my estimation, these are the heroes of the 20th century. But as much as we talk about the Jewish story, the Jews are not the only people involved in the story. And ultimately, we have to move on. Well, let me back up. I forgot about this slide. And this is the real revenge for the Holocaust survivors. The real revenge was the grandchildren. Survivors often didn't speak to their children about their experiences during the Holocaust. It was too hard, and oftentimes people didn't want to hear. And many times survivors didn't want their children to be enveloped in the darkness that was the Holocaust. But when the grandchildren came along, oh, that was a different story. At that point in their lives, they realized that time is going forward, and if they do not speak about their experiences, who will know? And so grandchildren come along, and Holocaust survivors begin to speak. And so the story is told of a grandson who goes to his grandfather. This happens in Toronto about 12 years ago. And he wants to hear his grandfather's story. And his grandfather begins to talk about his beloved little sister who was murdered in the Holocaust. And the longer he talks, the more agitated he becomes. And the more agitated he becomes, the more concerned his grandson becomes. And so he breaks off the conversation. But he's a curious grandson. And so he goes to the Yad Vashem website, where we have a database of victims of the Holocaust, a project that began in the 50s, and to date we have 4.4 million names on individual pages of testimony. And on these pages of testimony, you have the details about the person that was murdered in the Holocaust, but you also have the submitter's details, the person who put the page at Yad Vashem. And so this grandson goes to the website, he's familiar with it, and he wants to see if maybe on a page of testimony he can find out more information about his grandfather's sister, his great aunt, who was so integral, so mourned by his grandfather. And so he goes to the website, and a page comes up, and guess what? It's not a page for his great aunt. It's a page of testimony for his grandfather. Well, his grandfather wasn't murdered in the Holocaust, clearly. Someone has made a mistake. And so he scrolls down the page to the submitter's details, and guess who submitted it? The baby sister, 63 years, living in Israel, has been mourning the loss of her brother, just as he's been mourning the loss of his sister. He's in Canada, she's in Israel, because of a curious grandson and this project at Yad Vashem. 63 years later, this little old man from Canada and this teeny tiny woman from Israel meet each other for the first time in Ben Gurion Airport. If you go to YouTube, you can find the film. It is amazing. Amazing. So this, too, is the revenge of the survivor. And now we are here, fully into the darkness of this period. The perpetrator always had a choice, because there's always a choice for the person who believes that moral and ethical behavior stand paramount to everything. It wasn't just the Germans. It wasn't just the soldiers. There was tremendous amounts of collaboration in terms of the perpetration during the Holocaust. The Romanians killed 300,000 of their neighbors, and they didn't wait for Nazi orders. They did it because they believed in it. They did it because they wanted to. There are numerous books to be recommended on the topic, but one story. It wasn't just soldiers that went to the east, to the mass shootings that happened in 1941, beginning in June of 1941. It was also reserve policemen. A battalion of 500 reserve policemen from Munich career policemen. Median age of these men, 36 years old. 73% of them are married and have children. And these reserve policemen are brought to the east, and the morning comes when they get the order that they're going to be engaged in the shooting of innocent men, women, and children. Now, if you have ever believed that the perpetrator had no choice, let me disabuse you of that misconception. The perpetrator always had a choice. There is no historical evidence to suggest that anyone was ever shot for refusing to murder innocent men, women, and children. There is nothing in 200 million pages of archival material at Yad Vashem. Nothing. So the morning comes, the commander explains what the duty is, 500 men. And then he says, if anyone doesn't want to do this, he can put down his gun. No harm, no foul. Everything's fine. How many people put down the gun? One. One police officer said, "This is not who I am. I'm a police officer, not a murderer. Send me back to Munich." And they did. No loss of rank, probably a little kidding from his friends, few unkind and calculated remarks, but other than that, there were no consequences. He went back to his family and resumed his career as a police officer. Because of his actions, 11 other men put down their rifles and walked away from the killing fields. It tells us a lot about the power of one, the power to make a choice that makes the world a better place, not a more brutal or evil place. This is the killing field at Ponar, one of the mass killing sites during the Shoah. And the quote comes from an auxiliary policeman. And he says, "It was made clear to us that we could refuse to obey an order to participate in the Sonderaktionen, the mass killing, without adverse consequences." You don't have to believe me. Believe the guy that was there. He's telling you that they didn't have to do it. I knew of no case and still know of no case today where one of us was sentenced to death because he did not want to take part in the execution of the Jews. Even after the war, even after they're talking to each other, everyone tells the same story. They didn't have to do it. They did it because they wanted to, because they believed in it. Now, when I showed you the last slide, I presume that the quotation and the picture of the killing field made sense to you. They go together, yes? So why, when I show you such a terrible, terrible quote, do I juxtapose it with a kindergarten? The reason is simple. Chilling, but simple. Those babies, they're the real enemy. It's not the parents. It's not the grandparents. It's the generation coming up. And we have it out of the mouth of the perpetrator. Otto Ohlendorf, one of the heads of one of the mass shooting groups, the Einsatzgruppen, says, "We knew very clearly if we killed the parents, what have we done? The next generation of Jews will come up and they'll be a problem for the Third Reich. So in order to solve the problem, in order to have a final solution, we have to kill the children. This is the darkness that was the Holocaust. Now we move to our last group. And this is a continuum. It goes from collaboration all the way to righteous among the nations. Now the picture that you're looking at on your left-hand side is an historical photograph from Kristallnacht, 1938, the burning of the synagogues, the beginning of the downfall. And I bring it to your attention because when we talk about the bystander, there they are. Now, when I use it in a classroom, I ask teachers to look closely at the photograph and tell me what they see. And of course, if I opened it to you, you would tell me that you can see a synagogue, or at least a building that's on fire, and lots of people standing around. And then I would ask you, what don't you see? And sometimes it takes teachers in a classroom a few minutes to realize, a few seconds to realize what it is they don't see. There's a building on fire. Where are the firemen? Where's the water? Have you ever seen a fire that nobody's bothering to put out? And what about the people standing there? Do they look concerned? Do they look worried? This is the man on the street. When we look at the people that were willing to allow this, look at them. Nobody looks concerned. If you look at their body language, no one is anxious. And as a last thing to look at in terms of this kind of historic documentation, think about the action of the photographer. What is he telling you by his choice of stance in terms of taking this picture? There's nothing to suggest that whoever took the picture couldn't say, excuse me, make his way into the crowd and take it from the opposite angle. Then we would see the faces of the people that are watching. So one might posit that it is a deliberate decision to allow the bystander to remain anonymous. Albert Einstein once said, "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything." Einstein left Germany in 1932 after his picture appeared in a magazine with the caption, "Not yet hung." So we start with perhaps the bystander, and it's a long continuum, and it's not an exact one. Sometimes the bystander or the collaborator can move in the direction of righteous behavior. And so the obvious example for us is Oskar Schindler. You may or may not have seen the movie, but Oskar Schindler begins the war as someone who is benefiting from what's happening to the Jews. He buys up property. And then, and I'm going to use the movie as the example, there's a scene in the movie where Oskar Schindler is out for a ride on a spring day. On the horse next to him is a beautiful blonde, not his wife, but that would be a different lecture. And below them is the mass deportation of the Jews of the Krakow ghetto. The ghetto is being liquidated. So we have Oskar Schindler up above, and the Jews, this mass of screaming, terrified, herded people out of the ghetto down below. And it is that moment that a little girl in a red coat goes by. The entire movie is in black and white, except for the little girl in the red coat. And I would suggest to you that while it is a way of making a point in the film, The point that's made is whatever the symbol was, it was that moment that Oskar Schindler saw not a mass of screaming, dirty, hungry people, Jews, but saw the face of the individual. When we look specifically at Holocaust education, as teachers, our mandate is always to see the face of the individual and bring it into our classrooms. Perhaps that's our mandate as human beings as well. On the other end of this continuum is righteous among the nations. As of 2017, there were 26,513 people that have been recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. And it is a stiff criteria that has to be met. There must be a lot of documentation. If possible, there has to be testimony from the Jew that was saved. It's a long process. And 26,513 people is either a lot or very few, depending on your perspective. But thank God there were 26,513. The men that you see standing on the right side in that picture are two pastors, two Huguenot pastors and a school principal from a place in unoccupied France called Le Chambon-sur-Lyon. It is the only community of believers that was recognized by Yad Vashem as a community. Denmark, as you may or may not be aware, saved 7,200 of its 8,000 Jews. Yet in this tiny place, on the top of a mountain, a plateau, rocky, barren, poor, 5,000 Huguenots saved between 3,500 and 5,000 Jews. And they never asked for anything. They risked their lives to save the Jewish people because they saw the Jewish people as the people of God. And because for them, it was part of a scriptural base of their own belief system that led them to do that. That and the fact that in 1572, the Huguenots were massacred in numbers estimated as high as 110,000. In 1572, 110,000 is the whole world. So I suggest to you that part of the reason that the Chambonnais were so invested in saving the Jewish people was because they looked through the lens of their own persecuted past. When we began, you saw on the slide Jews, perpetrators, and bystanders. You saw these two faces. Now you see them as time has gone forward. On the left side is Renata Schindler, one of the heroines of the Warsaw Ghetto. She smuggled 1,000+ children out of the ghetto, risking her own life to do it, because for her it was about her faith and about the face of these young, innocent children who did not deserve what was happening to them. Renata Schindler saw the chance to do something, and so she did. The gentleman on the right-hand side, handsome as a young man, pretty handsome still as an older gentleman, is Nicholas Winton. Nicholas Winton had the opportunity to go from Great Britain to Czechoslovakia in 1938. He had a friend there, and the friend called him and said, "Nicky, you have to come. You have to see what's happening here." By virtue of witnessing what was happening to the Jews in Czechoslovakia, especially the children, he felt obligated to act. And so he got in touch with the Home Office in Great Britain. They said, "Yes, we'll accept some children in, but here's the criteria." And in his own words, he said, so I made up some very formal stationery, and I spoke to the chairman of this new organization, who just happened to be myself. And he worked tirelessly and left a committee behind to enable 669 children to get out of Czechoslovakia. This is his story.
All the letters. Back here is the list of all the children. This is Vera Diamant, now Vera Gissing. We did find her name on his list. Vera Gissing is with us here tonight. Hello, Vera. And I should tell you that you are actually sitting next to Nicholas Winton.
And it was just so wonderful, so terribly, terribly touching.
Who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please?
Nicholas Winton was just a guy who happened to be in a place and saw that something needed to be done. And since he was just the guy that was there, he did it. He goes back to Great Britain. He serves his country in the war. The war ends. He marries his sweetheart. His mother never liked her. And life goes forward. They have children. 50 years after the fact, his wife finds the scrapbook in the attic. 50 years later, she had no idea. He had never said anything to anybody because he didn't believe that he had done anything extraordinary. And he certainly didn't want any praise for it. And so then what you saw just now happens. 669 children he got out of Czechoslovakia on trains, 7 trains full of children. The 8th train, the largest departure of children intended up to that point, was scheduled to leave. It never left the station because it was September the 1st, 1939, and World War II had officially begun. Nicholas Winton has received many, many accolades. He was knighted by the Queen of England. He's Sir Nicholas Winton. And in 2014, he returned to Prague to be admitted to the Czech Order of the White Lion. The Czech president, Miloš Zeman, said, "You gave these children the greatest possible gift, the chance to live and be free. You did not think of yourself as a hero, but you were conducted by a desire to help those who could not defend themselves, those who were vulnerable. Your life is an example of humanity, selflessness, personal courage, and modesty. There are an estimated 6,000 descendants of Nicky's children. The action of one man." It portrays for us once more the power of one. We all have the possibility of doing great things. anonymously or not anonymously. But we can look to the Holocaust and the stories there as our model. Let me tell you one last very personal story. This is Sarah Sillers. Sarah is an educator in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, the seminars that I run at Yad Vashem, or that I coordinate at Yad Vashem, run anywhere from about 12 days to 19 days. But I was brought in to do a 3-day, very short seminar for some educators from Milwaukee. Sarah Sillers was one of them. And I told the Nicholas Winton story. I basically told this group everything that I've told you tonight. And when I begin to talk about, or when the video begins to play with Nicholas Winton, I see Sarah wiping her eyes. And that's not unexpected. There were people here tonight that were wiping their eyes. But then Sarah begins to cry. And then Sarah begins to sob. And as an educator, I'm thinking, I don't know what I did, but please let me out of this classroom. The lecture finishes. Sarah comes up to me and she says, "May I tell you a story? I'm sorry if I, threw you off your lecture. It wasn't you, it was me." And I said, "Please tell me a story, because right now I'm feeling kind of badly about my teaching expertise and I'd like to know what's going on here." And so she tells me that she has a 4-year-old son named Max. Max loves the beach and cotton candy and laughing. When Sarah was pregnant with Max, her local physicians did a lot of different tests, each one more extensive than the other, because there was a question about the pregnancy. The doctors in Milwaukee believed that Sarah had trisomy 18, or actually the baby had trisomy 18. This is a genetic abnormality, defect, that results always in the baby being born and dying several hours after birth. You can imagine Sarah's response to this. And she begged her doctors, "Look, there has to be somebody else, there has to be something else. Send me anywhere. I want my baby to live. Tell me what to do." And one of her pediatrician, obstetrician doctors in Milwaukee said, "Well, actually, there might be one shot for you and the baby. There's a doctor in Madison, Wisconsin. I recommend that as a final leap of faith, you go to see her." This is Dr. Renata Lox Ova. Renata Lox Ova is a genetic obstetrician, pediatrician. She was educated at Oxford. She married a boy from Wisconsin that she met while she was in school in the UK, and that's why she was presently doing her pediatric genetic work at Madison. Renata Lox Ova was born in Prague. She only wound up in the UK because she was on one of the 7 trains of children that Nicholas Winton got out. Renata Lox Ova lived and was able to do the testing that was necessary to tell Sarah that the tests were incorrect, the baby did not have trisomy 18, and she could go forward with full confidence that a healthy baby boy was in her future. Because of the actions of a single man who saw something during the Holocaust going on in Czechoslovakia and believed because he was a witness to it, he must do something about it, a little girl named Renata had the opportunity to grow up, to get her medical degrees, to move to the United States, to meet Sarah Sillers. Because of one man's actions. Goodness does indeed leave us gasping. Thank you very much.